Water pollution is a global issue because fresh water is a very small portion of all the water available. Of course, 97% of the water on the planet is in the oceans, and 3% is fresh water, and the vast majority of that is in glaciers and ice caps. So there's very little fresh water freely available to humans, and it's very, very expensive to clean water once it's polluted. So it's better to keep the water in high quality to begin with than try to deal with the water after it's polluted. When we talk about pollution and waste in the environment, there's typically two kinds. There's organic waste, and those are perfectly natural. Those are part of the natural cycle of life. Those are wastes from organisms. The problem with those, if you have too much, then it overwhelms the ability of the system to deal with that. So you have to manage that waste somehow and keep it in the environment. With inorganic wastes, those are things that are not typical of the environment, things such as plastics and other kinds of chemicals that are not normally found in the environment, that the organisms that normally decompose waste have never experienced those in geologic history, and they don't have the ability to decompose those. So those are much more persistent. Non-point source pollution is runoff from broad, large areas. So if you have a river going through an agricultural field all along several different farms, the fertilizer running off from those farms is non-point source. And you can't go to a single point on that farm and say we need to regulate this and send it to a treatment plant. You have to do something about a very, very long stretch of river or a very broad area. The federal government is trying to work with farmers to encourage them to have a buffer zone of trees between their agricultural system and the fields and the rivers and stream banks, so that the trees can absorb those nutrients. And also if the streams start to flood, then they can flood into this forested area rather than flooding across the farm fields and picking up fertilizers and carrying them away. Urban runoff is non-point source pollution in most cases, and that's runoff from streets, from sidewalk. We use various chemicals to retard the weeds and prevent fungus from destroying our lawns. So those kind of things run off into our environment, into the lakes and rivers and streams. So if you have a city, especially with lots of vehicles, you have oil dripping on the ground, gasoline spills, all those kind of things run off into the system. Point source pollution is actually much easier to regulate. It's from a single pipe from a particular sewer plant, a particular factory, and there's one pipe that's releasing the pollution into a local area, or maybe a parking lot that has a single drain, the water's concentrated coming out one area. And it's easy to regulate those because you can go to that site, you can do some remediation, you can have that source of pollution put into a waste treatment plant and take care of it. So it's from a single point, as the name implies. But we're always going to depend on drainage systems. Anytime we have buildings, we have to have the water carried away from them, especially in Florida where we have these really heavy downpours very, very quickly. We have to have a way to carry the water safely away from the buildings. The issue is trying to keep other pollutants from mixing with that water as it runs off, or perhaps catching that water in catchment basins, as we have on campus here, Southern Landing, where we catch the runoff water from several parts of campus and allow the nutrients to be used up by plants and aquatic organisms in the wetland before it's discharged into the lake. And that's one way to keep these nutrients out of those systems. And it's something that a lot of places are experimenting with, is using natural systems to try to clean out the pollutants before it goes into rivers and streams. Southern Landing is a very practical solution. It does require some upfront investment and expense to create the site. They had to excavate the site, bring heavy earth moving equipment, and create the basin and then plant it with plants. But once it's created, it's fairly low maintenance. Occasionally, once every 5 to 6 years, they have to dredge it out to make sure the basin stays deep enough to hold water. And to build a plant that would take that out mechanically, a wastewater treatment plant of that sort, very, very expensive. It requires continuous operation, continuous maintenance, continuous replacement of the filters and such, and has to be staffed and manned by a number of people to operate the plant. And this wastewater treatment wetland, there's one person out there that manages the flow of the water, that detects the quality of the water discharging, and it runs itself, basically. It operates on its own. Well, Southern Landing is a wonderful example of an educational resource because it is sitting right here on Lake Hollingsworth on the Florida Southern campus, so this is an educational institution. Also, the lake itself has a sidewalk around it that many, many people every day use to walk through there. And it's rather aesthetic. It's got boardwalks through it, and that was part of the design, was to have boardwalks to attract people down to the site to look at it. So when they look at this site and wonder why it was put in there, they can read the signage and see the system in operation, and they can see the lake right next to it and see that it's improving the water quality of the lakes. It's a great resource to have where people can easily access it and see how it works and operates. And also, it's a wonderful resource for bringing birds in. So a lot of birds use that as habitat. So it serves two purposes, not only for our purposes of cleaning up the lake, but as habitat for birds, and then that attracts more people to enjoy the aesthetic beauty of the birds as well. So it's been a very, very, very good educational resource that's right out there for the public to see and sort of educate people on the value of these types of wetlands, and wetlands in general, even if it's not an artificial wetland, giving people the value of natural wetlands. I think our youngest generation is very interested in environmental issues, and they have to be. There's 7 billion people on the planet now, and it's going to perhaps reach as many as 9 billion by the time the youngest generation is my age. So they were going to have to deal with those issues. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of people suffering terrible consequences. So there is a real need for that, but I think the youngest generation is very interested in those problems and those issues, and they're recognizing that what they do does impact people around the world. So their choices can have impacts far outside their area. So we have to start thinking about our choices and thinking about what we want other people to have, and what kind of environment we want to have. And recognizing that the ecosystems and the environment provides us tremendous amount of services, just as we're talking about with southern landing and stormwater treatment wetlands. So people recognize if we leave these environmental systems in place and we allow the environment to help us clean these things up, we'll have a much better situation than trying to mechanically replicate the things that we have destroyed because we weren't taking proper care of them.